Most people think the worst part of war is the violence. But I found out that's not exactly true. What really hurts isn't the wounds you treat. It's the names that show up when you least expect them. I was a nurse during the winter of 1945 in a makeshift hospital out in the frozen fields of Germany. And I thought I'd seen the harshest parts of this world, until the day I was called to care for a soldier whose name almost made my heart stop beating. The moment I read that name on the chart, it felt like time snapped backward in an instant, throwing me straight into a past I'd spent my whole life trying to forget. What would you do if you had to save someone you could never acknowledge as your own? That was the choice I had to make in that moment, standing over my own wounded son, the one I left behind before he even knew how to say, Mommy. This story I'm about to share isn't really about bravery. It's about quiet love. About a secret I kept locked up for far too long, thinking silence was the only way to protect the one I loved most. Stay with me till the end, because what I learned in that war might help you understand a bit of the pain you carry quietly too, and show you that sometimes healing doesn't come from speaking louder, but from loving deeper. My name is Agnes Loretta Hughes. I'm 92 years old. I live in the attic of an old house in Milwaukee, where the wind still whistles through the cracks, and every nighttime shadow seems to whisper some memory I wish I could forget. I was a war nurse. I cared for men torn apart by pain, cold, and a homesickness no one could ever patch up. I served in a field hospital near Cologne, Germany, in the bitter winter of 1945. The sheets were more ice than fabric, and the air smelled like gunpowder and prayers that never reached heaven. Now, sitting here with my wrinkled fingers twisting the edge of my red embroidered shawl, all I want is to tell a story, a war story, but not the kind you find in books or movies. This one's made of silence, of names whispered in the dark, and of a secret that froze my soul. If you've got a moment, just a little moment, I'd love for you to stay here with me. Picture yourself stepping into my room, kicking off your rain-soaked shoes, and taking a warm cup of tea. I'm not telling this story to be remembered. I'm telling it so no one else has to carry the kind of weight I did, all alone, for so many years. So if this story moves something in you, share it. If it makes sense in your heart, subscribe to this channel and stay with me till the end, because some stories only make sense when they're heard with an open heart. The halls of that makeshift hospital were a kind of white that hurt your eyes. It wasn't the white of peace or of beginnings. It was a white that screamed silence, like a sheet pulled too tight over a body you already know won't be getting up again. I remember that first morning I walked into that building, with its broken windows, cold walls, and the sting of burnt ether in the air. There was a thick fog outside, draping the twisted trees like a widow's veil. Inside, all you could hear were boots on cement and the crackle of my trembling fingers inside threadbare wool gloves. Back then, I still tried to keep some dignity in my movements, folding sheets with care, lining up glass bottles on shelves like someone trying to save a sliver of order from the jaws of chaos. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could contain the brutality that happened within those cracked walls. I was assigned to the burns and amputee unit, way down at the end of the East Corridor. It was the coldest, most forgotten part of the building, and the one least visited by high-ranking officers. Maybe because the smell of necrotic flesh and the muffled cries were harder to explain in reports. I still remember the names of the first 15 young men I cared for. I remember the texture of their skin, the way they cried out for their mothers in fevered delirium, and how some of them begged for morphine before they were even fully conscious. One of them gripped my wrist so tightly during dressing changes that I'd be left with bruises for days. And still, I kept coming back. I came back because I knew the pain inside them was the same pain that lived inside me. It's strange what a nurse learns during wartime. You learn, for instance, how to hear moans and translate them into needs. You learn to spot a silent infection just by the way the skin changes color, or how a gaze shifts away from the ceiling. You learn not to ask too many questions, not to wonder where a boy came from, or why he keeps a shirt button in his trouser pocket. You learn to make absence your companion, and more than anything, you learn how to carry secrets you can never speak out loud. I was good at that, or at least, I made it look like I was. Maybe that's why they trusted me with the cases no one else wanted. The bodies bleeding from the inside, the eyes that couldn't stand to be seen anymore. The hospital didn't even have a name. It was more like an annex in an old abandoned school building. The beds were too narrow for the broad shoulders of American soldiers, and the windows never quite shut right. At night, the wind howled like something haunted. Many times I'd wake up with the feeling that someone was whispering my name outside the infirmary. But there was never anyone there. Just the creaking doors, the groan of iron bed frames, and the hiss of syringes boiling in a big metal pot. There was a red-headed nurse named Wallace who used to say the walls in that place had memory, that they soaked up the screams and gave them back as nightmares. I believed him, because some nights I heard voices from boys who'd already been buried. Voices calling for mothers, for sisters, for golden-haired girls who promised to come back by Christmas. One day, a French girl knocked on the door holding a piece of bread, wrapped in cloth and a faded photograph. She couldn't have been more than 11, wearing a patched-up dress sewn by tiny hands. I opened the door thinking it was someone from base, but it was just her. Skinny, silent, eyes way too scared for a child her age. She held up the photo and pointed to one of the empty beds. It was her brother's. He'd passed away 2 days earlier. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. I just placed my hand gently on her head and closed the door softly. She never came back, and the image of those tiny hands holding a broken photo still haunts me. That was the moment I finally understood that war was a factory of absences, and that we, the nurses, were nothing more than laborers of silence. Every shift was like an emotional roulette. We ran from bed to bed, dodging the eyes that begged us for more time, pretending hope still had a job to do. Some boys asked what came after. Others just wanted us to write down their last words on whatever scrap of paper we could find. Some needed to confess sins, declare love, or simply admit they were scared. I listened to all of it, and I kept it all. Not because I was brave, because I had no other choice. My body became the only cathedral where those confessions could live. And that cost me more than I can ever explain. I remember a boy named Benjamin. He had freckles and a playing card stitched into his uniform pocket. He arrived with no leg and no voice, but his eyes were whole. Every night I'd change his dressings, and he'd look at me like he knew I wouldn't last much longer in that place. One day he offered me the playing card. I said no. The next day, he died, and the card was gone. I never found it again. To this day, I wonder if it got caught somewhere in the folds of my coat. A quiet reminder that not everything in life should be turned away. That's how the weeks went. Month after month, barely eating, sleeping in fragments, handling grief like folding blood-stained sheets. And still, there were moments of tenderness. A nurse named Helen sang hymns during soldier baths. A German doctor who had defected taught us how to make splints from broken crates. A tired priest left his crucifix on the sink and never came back. Little gestures that held the world together by the thinnest thread. And me? I stayed. More distant from myself every day, but closer and closer to the voices no one else could hear. Until one day, The silence was broken by a list of names. A list delivered in a rush, handwritten, with shaky letters and too much urgency. It was the new wave of wounded, arriving before dawn. I glanced over the sheet like I always did. And there, right in the middle of the third line, between a Robert and a Sean, there was a name that didn't belong. A name I had spent years trying to bury. A name that froze me in place. And just like that, the blinding white of those hospital halls disappeared. There are things you find in war that stay with you for a lifetime. I'm not talking about scars, medals, or stolen keepsakes. I mean the things that linger once the noise dies down. Small fragments of silence that cling to you like wet leaves in autumn. And that morning, long before the sun had the strength to burn through the heavy fog hanging over the gray mountains, that's what I found tucked into the dirty sheets of an empty cot. A crumpled letter, stained along the edges, with ink blurred by the tears of someone no longer around to read it out loud. It was a piece of paper folded into quarters, its corners torn, and the name Billy written in the top corner in a child's handwriting. I hesitated before picking it up, like that slip of paper carried the weight of a living memory. But war teaches you that sometimes the act of touching means more than caution ever could. And that's how I ended up sitting on the cold bench in the locker room, apron stained across my lap, fingers holding that letter like it was someone's beating heart. It started with "Dear Daddy," and followed with words far too sweet for such a place of pain. "Mommy says you're coming home soon. I saved your seat at the table, okay?" Right there, in the bitter cold of Germany, in a room that smelled like formaldehyde, I broke apart in silence. I cried like a woman who knows too much. Because that piece of paper wasn't just a letter from a son to his father. It was a portrait of what war destroys long before it kills. The belief that love is enough. I didn't know who Billy was. Didn't know the man who had laid under that stiff sheet or where they'd taken his body. I only knew that letter would never reach where it was meant to go. And maybe that's why I kept it. Folded exactly as I found it. Crumpled, damaged, but whole enough to remind me that every soldier was more than a uniform and a serial number. From that day on, I started looking. In pockets, in boots, between half-finished dressings. There was always something left behind. A worn photo, a brass ring, a scrap of paper with someone's mum's favorite dinner recipe. And in time, I began to catalog it all in my mind. Not like a collector, but like someone refusing to let memory be defeated by forgetting. There was a soldier who slept with a pebble in his pocket. Another who kept a baby tooth in a tiny jar. I didn't ask why anymore. I just saw and remembered. Because sometimes a war nurse doesn't heal with gauze or injections. She heals with presence, with listening, with simply being there when no one else can bear to look. It was during one of those long, impossibly quiet nights that a new group of wounded arrived. I could sense the rhythm of their approach before the trucks even stopped. The smell of hot metal, the crunch of wheels over wet gravel, the muffled groans under wool blankets. The first stretcher carried a very young man, maybe 21, face covered in blood, a loose bandage wrapped around his stomach. His eyes were closed, but something about his expression stopped me cold. A detail I couldn't explain, a discomfort I couldn't name. Like his face belonged to a dream I'd forgotten. I began my routine as usual, cleaning, checking vitals, morphine. Then I saw it. Something clenched in his hand, something he wouldn't let go of, even unconscious. A piece of paper, another letter. But unlike the others, this one was neatly folded. No dirt, no blood, no tears. Just time etched into its creases and handwriting that was steady, deliberate. I nearly set it aside, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened it, the first words hit me like a punch to the chest. Mom, if I don't make it back, just know I tried to find you. My heart froze. The letter was short. So short it hurt. 1.5 lines, and a name at the end. A name I recognized from a time so far gone. It felt like a lie. In that moment, the hands holding the gauze began to shake. Sweat trickled down under my collar, and a dizziness swept over me, like the war had ended in that second and started all over again inside of me. I couldn't process it. The name, the handwriting, the way he clung to that paper like it was the only anchor, keeping him from drowning in pain. I stepped back from the stretcher like the floor was made of glass. I left the infirmary and sat on the steps outside, facing the frozen yard. Out there, the world carried on like nothing had happened. Doctors shouted orders, nurses ran back and forth, and me. I just stared at that piece of paper. It had a name on it that should never have found its way back to me. Not like this. A name I had spent my life trying to protect. A name I never thought I'd see in the middle of a war. And yet, there it was, in my hands, in the pocket of a bloodied soldier. A name that made me forget who I was. For a few seconds, for a few years, for all of forever. From that moment on, everything shifted. I moved like someone trying to wake from a bad dream. I looked at every patient like I was searching for familiar features. I touched their faces like I needed proof that there was still time. And all the while, I hid. Because if that name really was what I feared, what I longed for, then the war had just handed me something I never had the courage to look for. And maybe that was even crueler than loss itself, to discover he'd always been close, and I was the one who'd been too far away. In war, there are sounds more dangerous than bombs. The silence before bad news, for instance, or the clink of a metal pinned to the chest of someone who would have given anything to come back whole. But there's one sound that haunts me still. The sharp, steady thump of a captain's boots echoing down the hallway, paper in hand, urgency in his eyes. That's how it always happened. The captain arrived with names, names coming by truck, or names that would never arrive at all. And when he appeared that freezing morning, coat crusted with dried mud and eyes sunken like trenches, I knew something was about to break. He didn't say a word, just handed me the clipboard with the medical records and marched off toward the surgery room with his heavy, determined stride. I stood still, shawl barely covering my shoulders, hands still damp from washing a burn patient. I looked over the list slowly. I always read them carefully to organize the ward before the wounded came in. It had become a habit. But that morning my eyes went straight to the third name, as if the list had called me, as if the paper already knew I needed to see it first. And there it was, written in small, almost shy letters, like it was trying not to be noticed among the others. Private First Class Samuel Hughes. My heart didn't beat. It collapsed. The world around me folded in an instant. My stomach twisted. My knees went soft. My throat closed. That wasn't a coincidence. That was fate grabbing me by the collar and forcing me to face what I'd buried decades ago. My boy. The name I gave when no one else would. The name I wrote down in silence, alone in a rented room, with tears falling onto the pages of a Bible. Samuel. No one ever knew he was mine, not even him. When I left him with my sister, I was only 18. I had just finished school at the convent, and the world was far too big for a girl who had loved where she wasn't supposed to. His father left before he even knew there was a baby. And me? I was sent away with a small suitcase, a floral dress, and shame buried deep in my bones. My sister promised to raise him as her own. "It's better this way," she said. "You're young. You still have a life ahead of you." But the life I had was made of patches. Patches of silence, of quiet memories, of letters never sent. I worked as a nurse, a seamstress, a companion for old ladies who died calling for sons that never came. And when the war started and they asked for volunteers to care for the wounded, I went. I went because I wanted to run from the past. I thought other people's pain might drown out my own. But pain has a way of sniffing you out. It finds you even when you change your name, your city, your uniform. I stood there holding the chart, unsure whether to run or collapse. I looked again. It could have been another Samuel Hughes. A common name, maybe. But the last name, the age, the state he was from, it all matched. It was him. And he was coming to me, wounded, maybe unconscious, maybe on the edge of death. And I would have to care for him without revealing who he was to me. I'd have to hide in my hands the tremble of a mother, seeing her child again. A child she never got to call my son. The next few hours were a blur. Nurses ran, stretchers rolled in, bodies caked in mud, blood, and snow. Cries of pain mingled with the smell of ether and burnt flesh. I searched every face, looking for the one that was mine, but wouldn't know me. And when I finally saw him, time stopped. He was unconscious. A deep cut ran along the side of his face, one eye swollen shut, his lip cracked. And still, it was him. That same sharp nose, those thick eyebrows, the way his chin trembled, even asleep, the same way it had when he was a baby. I moved closer without a word. I touched his forehead like someone reaching out to a sacred relic. And for one breathless second, I felt the whole universe bow to that moment. The world could explode outside the room, but between us there was only silence, heavy, ancient, unbreakable. I began my care as I would with any soldier, methodical, steady. But with every movement, memories came rushing in. I remembered his first cry, the day I gave his blue blanket to my sister, the time I almost went to his school just to watch him from afar. And now, he was here, hurt, under my care, and I couldn't say a word. It was like tending to a part of myself I never had the right to claim. I told no one, not the head nurse, not Helen, who worked every shift with me. It was my secret, maybe even my punishment. The war had handed me the reunion I had prayed for in silence every night, but it came with the price of not being able to say his name the way it ached inside me. Samuel, my boy, my soldier. For 3 days he drifted between lucidity and delirium. He muttered names I didn't know. He called for an aunt, my sister. And on one night just before dawn, he whispered something that hollowed me out inside. Mom. That's all. One word. Soft, barely there. But said with a tenderness I've never heard again. I was right beside him, and for a moment I wanted to answer. I wanted to say, I'm here. But fear silenced me. The whole world silenced me. I stayed quiet and cried. Because in war, sometimes the deepest wounds are the things you can never say out loud. There were things on his body only a mother could recognize, and no war could erase. The way his fingers curled slightly inward when he slept, like he was holding something invisible. The little crease between his brows, inherited from his father, that always appeared just before the pain set in, even before the fever. And above all, the scar. An old scar, fine as a pencil line, tucked near his left shoulder, right by the collarbone. It was like a whisper from the past that no one else remembered, except me. He was 2 when he hurt himself in that exact spot. Fell off a stool reaching for a cup in the kitchen cabinet. I had my back turned, scrubbing laundry, and only heard the dull thud and the choked cry. I ran, scooped him up, held him tight to my chest, and felt the warm blood trickling down. We walked to the clinic, me sweating, shaking, promising over and over that I'd never take my eyes off him again. The scar stayed, small, crooked, but visible. And now, there it was again, in front of me, years later, on a grown, wounded body, in a war hospital that had taken everything from me, except the memory of that day. When I lifted the torn shirt and saw the mark, I couldn't stop the sob that burst from my chest. I stepped back like the floor had turned to fire. It was him. No more doubt. The boy from the stool, the one from the folded letter, the name that froze me in place. It all fit together like pieces of a painful puzzle. And still, even with my heart pounding like a drum, I forced myself to keep going, to grab the bandages, prep the morphine, check his vitals with steady hands. But inside I was unraveling. It was then, staring at that scar, that something awful hit me. I didn't know who he was now. I knew the boy I left behind. I knew the baby I wrapped in a thin blanket, but I didn't know the man. I didn't know how he laughed, if he feared the dark, if he liked music, if he believed in God. I knew his blood, but not his soul. And that hurt more than all the years apart. Because war steals time. And when time runs out, even love turns to silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat beside his bed in a hard wooden chair, wrapped in my red shawl like I was holding an old promise. I watched his uneven breathing, the small movements, the whimpers that slipped through his clenched teeth. Sometimes he called out names. Never mine. Sometimes he seemed to smile in his sleep, and I wondered if it was from a happy memory, or just his body faking comfort. At one point he opened his eyes, just for a second, and looked at me. I froze. He didn't speak, just stared, like he saw me without really recognizing me, like part of him knew, but didn't want to know. Then he closed his eyes again, and I stayed right there. Before dawn, he started to drift into delirium. He called for Aunt Marion, my sister. Said he wanted to go home. Said it was cold. Said the dog was probably waiting. And then, in a moment of quiet, he mumbled something that shattered me. Mom sent me away, but I'm not mad at her. My throat closed up. My whole body trembled. He didn't know I was there. But some part of him had already forgiven me. That tore through me like an invisible shard, and all I could do was hold his hand and whisper, "You are loved." Small words, far too small for all I wanted to say. But in war, sometimes that's all we have to give. While the other soldiers slept or mumbled through their fevers, I stayed by his side, watching, and I started to notice more. The way his feet twitched just before he woke up, just like when he was a baby. The way he pursed his lips when the pain got worse. Little fragments of childhood that had survived time and terror. And every gesture told me a story I never got to live. Every breath brought back a chapter I had missed. And there, in that cold room, I understood that motherhood can also be made of absence. That loving someone, from afar, in silence, without permission, is still love. He started to get better, slowly. The fever broke. The wounds began to close. And with that came the fear. Because the better he got, the closer came the moment he would leave. And I wouldn't know where he was going. The closer came the second I'd lose him again. I wanted to touch him, call him, tell him everything. But war teaches you to stay quiet. Teaches you that some secrets are like scars, visible but never spoken of. And maybe love is like that too. A quiet presence, a nameless care. The scent of childhood on a scarred shoulder. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew that moment, that scar, that scent of childhood that clung to the air between the morphine and the blood, was all I had. And so I stayed, in the corner, in silence, as if love had to hide to survive the war. Not every woman carries a photograph in her purse. Some hide portraits inside themselves, where no one else can see. I was like that. I had a small wooden frame, light-colored and chipped along the edges, that I kept hidden for nearly 50 years. It held the only picture I had of Samuel as a baby. Eyes closed, fists clenched, like he already didn't trust the world. We took that photo on a cloudy afternoon, back when he still fit entirely in my lap. I wore a light blue dress, and he had on a little romper with buttons that never stayed put. The photographer kept telling me to smile. I tried, but the smile came out crooked, because I already knew that image would be the last piece of me he'd carry. I kept the photo in a brown envelope, tucked between the pages of my Bible. The same Bible my mother gave me when I left home. That Bible went everywhere with me. Boarding houses, hospitals, trains, military quarters. And every time I moved from one bed or city to another, the first thing I did was check that the photo was still there. Untouched, quiet, intact like the longing. I never showed it to anyone. Not to the other nurses, not to the few men who tried to love me over the years. Samuel was my secret, my shield and my wound. During the war, I carried him with me in thought, but never pulled the photo from the Bible. I couldn't. It would have been like tearing the fabric of the silence that kept me safe. The other women talked about fiancés, letters from soldiers, children left in the arms of husbands who promised to return. I listened. I smiled. Sometimes I gave advice. But inside, I was just absence. I had a son, but no one knew. I had lost him in life. And that tiny frame was all that remained of the woman I was before the world cracked open. On the third night after Samuel arrived at the hospital, I came back to my quarters with my feet heavy as stone. There was dried blood beneath my nails. My forehead throbbed, and the silence inside me beat like a drum with no rhythm. I sat on the edge of my bed, peeled off my soiled apron, and opened the Bible with shaky hands. There he was, still whole. I looked at that wrinkled baby face like it was a mirror of all that would never be, and I cried. I cried with my whole body, not just for what had happened, but for everything that never did. I started carrying the photo in the pocket of my coat, but only during the night shifts. It stayed close to my heart, and sometimes when the world felt like it was falling apart, I'd hold it through the fabric, like it was a talisman. It wasn't just an image. It was the one thing that reminded me that, even without a voice, I was still a mother, that someone out there carried my blood, even if he didn't know my name. And now, that someone was only a few feet away, breathing through morphine and machines, unaware that his adult face still fit inside the picture I hid near my chest. I dreamed about him, dreamed of impossible moments, of him calling me Mom in a train station, of me holding his hand as he was discharged, saying, "I stayed the whole time." Dreamed of a Christmas that would never come, a set table, dim lights, and him asking about my youth. But when I woke, it was always the same hospital room, the same creaking bed beside mine, the same drip, drip, drip of the IV. And that silence, always the silence. Because in war, love must be buried so that hope can survive. One day, Helen, my fellow nurse, walked into the room without warning. I was turned away, holding the photo, whispering to it like he was a baby again. She coughed. I tucked it away quickly. She didn't ask anything, but gave me a strange look, like she sensed something she couldn't name. That was the only time I almost got caught. After that, I went back to hiding the photo in the Bible. I wrapped it in an extra layer of cloth, like someone guarding a sacred relic, because that's exactly what it was. My private holy thing. One night, while Samuel slept, I sat by his bed with the photo in my lap. I compared his grown face to the baby face I had memorized. Some features had stayed. The curve of his chin, the softness of his upper lip, the way his brow furrowed even in rest. And in that moment, I felt certain of something I had never dared to think. He had lived well, even without me. There was strength in that body. There was fight in that silence. And somehow, that freed me from a piece of the guilt I had carried. But it also broke me, because I saw how time had betrayed us, pulled us apart with surgical precision, gave him a life without me, and me, a longing without a body. And now, with fate putting us face to face again, it was too late to rewrite the chapters we'd missed. All that was left was to care, quietly, secretly, like I always had. When he started getting better, I thought about writing a letter. I drafted it many times. Each one ended at the same sentence. I am your mother. But I never gave it to him. The war had already taken too much from both of us. And I knew he might not be ready. Or worse, he might be, and still not want to know. And that fear kept me silent. Like the photo in the Bible. Like everything I had lived through. Sometimes I think loving someone in silence is the purest kind of love there is. It asks for nothing in return. No recognition. It just is. And it survives. Even in absence. Even in distance. Even in war. Some words don't need to be shouted to pierce someone's soul. Sometimes a whisper, spoken between fever and sleep, carries more truth than 1,000 promises made in daylight. And on that gray morning, with fog still clinging to the bare branches outside the ward, I heard the one word I had been waiting to hear since I first knew he existed. Mom. That was it. Just 2 syllables, scattered between shallow breaths, murmured with the sweetness of someone who doesn't know they're being heard. He didn't open his eyes. He lay still, pale as the light slipping through the cracked windows. His forehead was damp with sweat, his lips cracked. His hands rested over his chest, and the blanket wrapped around him like a nest thrown together in the middle of chaos. I was sitting beside his bed, reading quietly, eyes heavy, the photograph hidden in my apron pocket. When I heard that word, everything around me disappeared. The noise of soldiers being wheeled down the hallway, the creak of the record player in the resting room. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And I froze. Mom. It was a soft call, barely audible, a thread of sound slipping from the unconscious. But it hit me like thunder. My whole body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart pounded so hard I thought someone would hear it. My hands shook on my knees. I brought one to my mouth, trying to hold back the cry building inside me. That moment, so brief and yet so immense, felt like a miracle unfolding in secret. A meeting point between what was and what never got to be. He slept for hours after that, and I didn't leave his side. I stayed unmoving, like a sentry guarding lost love. I hoped that when he woke he'd say it again. But this time, with his eyes open, with awareness, with presence. I wanted that word to be meant for me. Not just the fever talking, but war doesn't repeat its miracles. And when he finally opened his eyes, the only thing he said was, water. Then he coughed, turned his head, and slipped back into sleep. He didn't recognize me, didn't call for me, and a part of me cracked in silence. I spent the rest of my shift living between 2 worlds. One part of me still seated beside his bed, holding onto that word with both hands like a wounded bird. The other washing trays, refilling bottles, recording temperatures like it was just another Wednesday in a war hospital. But it wasn't. Because once your child calls for you, even without knowing, nothing is ever ordinary again. Later, alone in the locker room, I opened the small envelope and took out the photograph. I looked at that baby face with closed eyes and whispered the answer I didn't have the courage to give earlier. "I'm here, my son." I said it slowly, almost like reciting a prayer. "I'm here. I always have been." And the pain that passed through me in that moment was beautiful, heavy, but beautiful, like the sound of an old piano playing a forgotten tune. It was the kind of pain that comes with too much love. Love that got trapped. Love that survived in silence. I didn't know if he would remember, if that word was just an echo from childhood. Maybe my sister had told him once, on some fearful night, that his mother was out there somewhere, alive, absent, distant like a burned-out star. Maybe he was just repeating what boys often muttered in the middle of a fever. Or maybe, on some level deeper than consciousness, he knew, felt it. Like babies know when they're in their mother's arms. Like animals know how to find their way home. A knowing that can't be taught, only carried. The next night I prepared everything with even more care. Changed his sheets with gentle hands. Adjusted the lamplight. Placed the water within reach. And before I left the ward, I tucked the photo back into my Bible. But this time, left it on the shelf in the resting room. It was a foolish gesture, maybe, but part of me wanted him to find it, to feel it, to stumble upon it without knowing, as if love had the power to guide hands in the dark. But he never saw it, never looked that way. He kept healing, growing stronger, finding his voice again. And I began to withdraw, a little more each day, like someone who knows the miracle came, and won't come again. I started seeing him through eyes of silence. The touch of my hand on his became shorter, my steps more distant. Not out of lack of love, but because of how much there was. Because sometimes, to love is to know when not to cross a line, when to let someone walk on, never knowing what they were saved from. Mom. I still hear that word echoing through the cracks of those hospital windows, tangled in the scent of ether, in the squeak of gurney wheels, in the whispered prayers of the other nurses. It wasn't a cry. It was a confession, a prayer, a bridge between who I was and who I never stopped being. And even though he never said it again, even though he moved on without knowing, I heard it, and that was enough. Maybe not enough to change the past, but enough to let peace live inside me, even if only for a moment. What scares me most about war isn't the explosions, or the bodies piled behind the tents, or even the sound of someone dying without a name. What scares me is how quickly everything changes. How a decision made by someone far away, sitting behind a desk, can rip a piece of you away, without warning, without ceremony, without forgiveness. And that's how he left me for the second time, because of a medical transfer order, scribbled in pen at the top of a hastily folded sheet of paper. Just a piece of paper that said, in cold letters, my son was being moved. And I wouldn't even have time to look him in the eyes. The news came on a murky morning, the kind where fog seeps in through every crack in the windows. I already felt something coming. I felt it in my bones, the way birds sense the rain. The head nurse pulled me aside while I was emptying a bucket of expired morphine. She said 3 soldiers were being transferred to the main base, 100 kilometers away, where there'd be better surgery conditions. When I read the names on the clipboard, there he was, Samuel Hughes, my boy, my blood. My whole body went cold. "He's leaving by ambulance tomorrow morning," she said, not seeing the tear that burned behind my eyes. "He's improving well, but they have more resources there." I nodded, agreed, pretended, and as soon as I turned away, my breath caught. I had to lean against the wall. The hallway spun. My chest felt crushed from the inside, because I knew that order meant more than a transfer. It was another goodbye. The first had been decided by my sister, with promises and excuses. This one by the randomness of war. But both took him from me, before I could say what needed to be said. That night I sat beside him for hours. Samuel slept more peacefully now. The fever had broken. The wounds were healing. His face was almost calm. I wanted to say, "Stay." I wanted to beg, with my soul in my throat. "Don't go." But all I could do was lightly stroke his hand, as if trying to memorize a whole lifetime in a single brief touch. I thought about waking him, about telling him the truth, about giving him the letter I had finally written that afternoon, with trembling hands and words that kept escaping. But fear won again. I felt too old to risk it, too small to belong to that moment. After all, he was alive. He was getting better. He had a life ahead of him. And me, I was just a war nurse, a shadow on the battlefield, one of many women who loved in silence and passed unnoticed. Telling the truth would have meant asking him to carry a burden he never chose, and deep down, I already knew. My job was to care, not to claim. To love, yes, but from a distance, as it had always been. Before dawn, I prepared his things with the same care I once used, dressing him for the last time, when he still wore diapers and chewed his fingers. I folded his blanket, wrote his name firmly on the ID tag. I slipped the letter into my apron pocket but didn't give it to him. I left my Bible open on Psalm 91, on the dresser, an old superstition I inherited from my mother. "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High," she used to say, "will never be forgotten." And that's what I needed to believe, that even if he left, he wouldn't forget me, not even if only by instinct. The truck arrived early, engine rumbling, smoke pouring from the exhaust. The soldiers were woken one by one, and the nurses helped them into heavy clothes. I was shaking. Every step felt like the last, every gesture an invisible farewell. When it was Samuel's turn, I walked over with his folded uniform in my arms. He was still groggy, eyes unfocused. He dressed slowly, shoulder bandaged, voice hoarse. He mumbled something about being back soon. I smiled, nodded, and hoped he was right, that one day he would return, even if he never understood what return meant to me. At the truck, he looked back, searched for someone, and for 1 second, our eyes met. There he was, my son, in his 20s, a grown man, and at the same time the same baby I had wrapped in a floral blanket and let go. I wanted to run to him, hold him, say, "I am your mother." But all I did was raise my hand in a quiet wave. He smiled, a small smile, but it was real. And then he climbed into the truck, and he left. I stood there, frozen, the wind sharp on my face. The other nurses returned to work. The routine noises resumed, trays clattering, footsteps hurrying, medical orders being called out. But inside me, everything was still. It was like time had stopped, and all that remained was his scent in the air, the warmth of his body still lingering in the chair, the empty space of the bed he once filled. I went back to the infirmary and sat beside the now empty cot. I pulled the letter from my pocket, stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, I tore it into tiny pieces and let the scraps fall onto my lap. I didn't have the strength to rewrite it, or the courage to hope he'd return. I had done all I could. I cared. With everything I had, with every memory, with every bit of love only a silent mother knows how to give. And on that day, I learned that saying goodbye without meeting someone's eyes can be crueler than never saying it at all. Months after he left, when spring was just starting to peek through the frozen wreckage of Germany, a shipment of personal belongings arrived at the infirmary. Small boxes, some splintered wood, others soggy cardboard, each one numbered, with names penciled across the lids like tiny reliquaries of men who no longer belonged anywhere. It was standard protocol. Gather what was left behind by wounded or transferred soldiers, then send it along to their families. Most held simple things. A folded letter, a cheap ring, an old photo with a note scrawled on the back. I helped organize the boxes carefully. It was solemn work, done in silence, with restrained glances and hesitant hands that lingered before opening each lid. That's when I saw it. A smaller box, light wood, softly rounded edges. Its serial number had been burned in with a branding iron. And underneath, a name. Hughes. My surname. Just that. No first name. No private. Only Hughes. For a moment, I thought my eyes were tricking me. I touched the surface like someone reaching for their own name in a dream. The heat of the brand still seemed to radiate from the grain. It couldn't be a coincidence. There were hundreds of Hughes scattered across the front. But I knew. The body knows. The heart recognizes. That box was his, Samuel's. Even though no one told me, even though there was no official letter, no confirmation, no report, I knew. In that instant, I knew. And everything around me faded away. I asked to be alone. I locked the small sorting room and knelt before the box like someone kneeling at an altar. I opened it slowly, afraid of what might be inside. There were only a few things. A neatly folded blue handkerchief, a dented metal pen, a small stained notebook, and a single loose page. It was standard military notepaper, the kind used for quick messages. The edges were marked with blood. And at the center, just one line, written in shaky handwriting. If I don't come back, tell her I understand. That's when my body gave out. I didn't cry the way I had before. I didn't scream. I didn't tremble. It was a collapse made of silence, a falling inward, built from absence, from what-ifs, from all the words never said. Tell her I understand. What did he understand? That I wasn't there? That I never came looking? That I loved him from afar, from fear, from shame, from cowardice? Or did he understand all of it? The silence, the hidden care, the presence without a name, the whispered prayers each night as he lay wounded, when I kissed his forehead while no one was looking. I picked up the handkerchief. It was soft cotton, the kind mothers used to embroider back in the day. It was clean, but it held a scent. That unmistakable scent of a child, a scent no war can erase. I pressed it to my chest and closed my eyes. For one moment there was no war, no hospital, no blood. There was only him, the image of his peaceful face as he slept, the memory of his lips forming "Mom," without knowing, the certainty that somehow he knew and forgave me. I returned to the infirmary in silence. I told no one. I kept the box with me until the end of the campaign. Then I smuggled it back, wrapped in a blanket, as if it were too fragile for the world to touch. I tucked it deep into the bottom of my trunk, beneath old clothes, hidden from curious eyes. For years I didn't have the courage to open it again. But every time I passed that trunk, I could feel his name pulsing from the wood, as if reminding me, I understood, and that's enough. That box became what was left of a story we never got to live. I never received an official letter saying whether he survived the surgery, whether he returned to the States, whether he built a life. My name was never listed as next of kin. I couldn't ask, and maybe, deep down, I never wanted to know, because sometimes doubt is easier to carry than the truth. Hope survives better in the shadow of uncertainty. In old age, I started sleeping with the box beside my bed, like someone keeping their heart outside their chest. Sometimes I'd lay the handkerchief across my face before falling asleep. Other nights I'd flip through the notebook, even when the words were too blurred to read. And every time I touched that wooden lid, carved with our shared name, I remembered that, despite everything, a part of him still lived with me. And that's why I'm telling you this now, because time taught me that not every kind of love needs explaining. Some loves are like forgotten boxes, closed out of fear, opened out of longing, and kept by those who never wanted to forget. And me, I never wanted to forget. I was already past 80 when I started taking the subway alone again. It had been years since I'd faced the chaos of the platforms, the screeching brakes, the rush of people who never have time to look you in the eyes. But that November morning, with my fingers swollen from arthritis and my coat hanging heavy on my shoulders, something inside me urged me to descend the steps of Cathedral Square Station and follow a path that hadn't belonged to my routine in a long time. I don't know if it was longing, intuition, or just the soul wanting to wander through the ruins of time. I only know that I went. And there, in the emptiest car of the off-hour train, somewhere between muffled conversation and the metallic echo of the tracks, I saw him. He was sitting at the back, near the grimy window. A tall man, gray hair like mine, stubbled face, wide hands. The kind of man who's lived too much. He wore a wrinkled brown overcoat, and resting gently on his knees was a photograph, folded in 4, worn down, as old as my memories. And still, something about it pulled me in before I even understood why. His eyes were fixed on the image. He didn't look away, didn't blink, as if trying to squeeze an answer out of that paper that would never come. I sat 2 seats away, stayed quiet, but my heart beat the way it does when you open a letter you know is going to hurt. I tilted my head slightly, trying to see better. The light flickered with each curve in the track, and for a moment, the reflection revealed what I feared. It was a child, a baby, dressed in white, eyes half closed, a faint smile on his lips. My body froze. It was the same photograph, the very same one I'd hidden for decades in my Bible, the one I took when he was only a few months old. It was my Samuel, the photo only I had. Or so I thought. My entire body locked up. My hands began to sweat. Part of me wanted to stand, to ask, to scream. Another part knew better. I studied the man more closely. The way he scratched his chin, the way his brow furrowed, the slow, heavy way he breathed, like someone carrying the weight of old questions. And I wondered, could it be him? Could it be Samuel? Had he survived the war, made it back to the States, grown up far from me, and, by some twist of fate, found that photo? My chest ached with fear and hope, fear of being wrong, hope that I wasn't losing my mind. The possibilities ran wild inside me like horses in a stampede. And finally, I understood I'd never know if I didn't move. If I didn't take one more chance. I stood carefully. My legs trembled. I walked toward him, slowly, sat in the seat in front of him. He didn't notice me at first, not until the train jolted around a sharper bend, and our eyes met. That look, dear God, I'll never forget it. There was no anger, no shock, just a mirror, as if he recognized me too but couldn't place the memory, as if we were 2 steps behind knowing. That child, I began, my voice rough. Is he your son? He hesitated, looked at the photo again, then replied softly, I don't know. They told me it might be me. My heart sank. Time stretched. Everything in me trembled. He thought it was him. And maybe it was. The same nose, the same chin, the same curve around the eyes. He went on. They found the photo among a soldier's things. Someone who died in Italy. It was inside a book. They say it belonged to his grandfather. No one ever figured out who the baby was. But one day, for some reason, my aunt showed it to me, said it could have been me. My throat tightened. I wanted to say, "You are my son." I wanted to reach for his hand, to place the blue handkerchief in it as living proof of what was never spoken. But courage, once again, failed me. I looked into his eyes and simply said, "It's a beautiful photograph." He nodded, folded it gently, slipped it back into his coat pocket like someone tucking away a secret. Then he asked, "Do you know that photo?" I smiled, bearing the weight of years. "Maybe. It reminds me of someone." We sat there in silence for a few minutes. Two ghosts from the past, sharing the same seat, the same winter, the same unnamed secret. And then his stop came. He stood, gave me one last glance, a look that spoke louder than any words, as if he understood, but chose not to say it, as if he forgave me, without knowing why. When he stepped off, I stayed. The train moved on, and I cried. Not from sorrow, but from a strange kind of relief. As if finally I had looked at him without fear. As if for a fleeting instant we had shared the truth without needing to explain it. He had grown. He had survived. And somehow, love had reached him. Folded in four, tucked into a pocket, deep in a moving subway car. Sometimes that's how love finds its way. It took me years to return to Germany. By then my hair was nearly white, my knees locked on stairs, and my heart carved with the scars of time. Still, when I received an invitation from a group of veterans to visit the old field hospitals now turned into memorials, something inside me lit up. It wasn't nostalgia. It was necessity. A quiet urgency to walk again through the place where I'd left pieces of myself in every hallway, every bed, every name left unspoken. The field where the makeshift hospital once stood in Aachen was now flat ground, covered in dry leaves and low brush. The building was gone. No walls, no broken windows, no white sheets fluttering in the wind. But there were still echoes. The creak of hinges lived in memory, and the smell of ether. Oh, that never really left me. I closed my eyes and I could hear the voices, the prayers, the groans, the secrets whispered into the cracks of dawn. I walked alone to the back of the grounds, where we used to bury the ones who didn't make it to the next evacuation. Most bodies were transferred. Others stayed. Wooden crosses, names carved with pocket knives, uncertain dates. It was a cemetery born of haste and sorrow. And there, behind a rusted fence, covered in moss and shadow, I found the cross, smaller than the rest, crooked, nearly falling. The wood darkened by time, grass growing thick around it, like it was trying to protect it from forgetting. I stepped closer, eyes burning, heart in my throat. And then I saw Samuel Hughes, 3 letters in the first name, 5 in the last, etched by hand, maybe with a blade held by someone long gone. And below, 1945. No month, no day, just the year. The year everything broke. The year he came to me and left without knowing. I knelt before the cross. The damp earth soaked the hem of my skirt. My hands touched the wood like they were touching his face one last time. And there, in front of that silent name, I collapsed. Everything I had kept for decades, every unsent letter, every mom I never heard again, every folded and hidden photograph, it all spilled out in that moment. Because there it was, the truth. No confirmation, no paperwork, no witnesses, but truth all the same. I stayed there for hours. I spoke to him, whispered lullabies I never got to sing, told him about the attic home in Milwaukee, about the wooden box with our last name, about the blue handkerchief. I told him I loved him, that I always had, that not a single day had passed without my thoughts reaching for him, even when the world told me to forget. And that now, finally, I was ready to let him rest. I left the photo there, that old photo I had carried through the war, through my life. I placed it at the base of the cross, covered it with my embroidered handkerchief, and murmured a prayer, not one I'd been taught, but one I made up, out of longing, out of forgiveness, out of love. Because some war stories don't end with gunfire. They end like this, with an old woman kneeling before the name she carried in her heart all her life, saying everything she never could say out loud. When I rose, the late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It felt like time bowed in reverence. The breeze touched my hair gently, and for a moment I swear I heard his footsteps behind me. But I didn't turn around. I just closed my eyes and let that moment become home. Because in that forgotten patch of earth I finally came back to where I belonged. There are names we never shout, only whisper, while making evening tea or staring out the window into a starless sky. Names that ache from being so deeply ours, but which time taught us to sew into the lining of our soul. His name. I carried it like a secret the world didn't deserve to hear. And even when he called me mother, without knowing, I stayed silent, because war didn't give me time, because silence felt safer than truth. Now, sitting here in my attic in Milwaukee, between the scent of old wood and the dust dancing near the broken record player, I realized the hardest war I ever fought wasn't in the fields of Germany or the icy wards where death lingered at every bed. It was inside me, in my chest, where a love was born before it was ever allowed, where the absence of a son grew alongside the absence of my own voice. I kept the blue handkerchief until the end. Sometimes I still place it on my lap, folded carefully, like skin, like it still holds his scent. And when I close my eyes, I can see him, sleeping peacefully, breathing like he did when he was a baby, before everything was lost, before the world pushed us apart, before I had to become just another war nurse among many, unseen, irrelevant, silent. But I know who I was. I was his mother, even if no one wrote it on paper, even if he never heard it from my lips. My dear, if you've listened to this story all the way through, thank you, from the bottom of this old and weathered heart, because sharing this secret even now, even too late, gave me back a piece of myself, reminded me that love, no matter how silent, never truly dies. It bends, it hides, it changes shape, but it lives, in photos, in scars, in the forgotten wooden crosses behind abandoned hospitals. If there's a name still pulsing inside you, someone you carry in silence, someone who still aches, who still whispers when no one's listening, know you are not alone. Sometimes it's in silence where the purest kind of love lives, the kind that asks for nothing, that needs no explanation, that just stays, like the root of an old tree, invisible, but strong. If this war story touched you, I ask you gently, share it, not for me, but for every woman who loved in the dark, who was a mother in secret, who cared without a name, without glory, without ending. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you can, write in the comments, what name do you still whisper at night? Because sometimes, all an emotional story needs to stay alive is someone willing to listen with an open heart.